Eleanor Hargrove pressed the $40 flat against the stranger's chest and said, "Give it back to him." The envelope crumpled under her palm. Around her, the Laramie platform went quiet, the way places go quiet when something irreversible is happening. The man holding the envelope, short, sweating, hat crushed between his hands, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. "Ma'am, Mr. Whitfield said—" "I heard what Mr. Whitfield said." Her voice didn't shake. Nothing about her shook. "Tell him Eleanor Hargrove didn't travel 1,100 miles to be paid off like a bad debt." If you want to know what happened when Eleanor showed up at that man's ranch door anyway, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The man's name was Hector Vargas, and he had the look of someone who'd drawn the shortest straw in a very bad lottery. "Mrs. Hargrove." He tried once more. The envelope was still in his hand, slightly crumpled now. "The money's yours by right. Travel costs, compensation for the—" "Mr. Vargas." Eleanor picked up her suitcase before he could reach for it. "What changed?" He opened his mouth, closed it. "Between March and now," she said. His last letter said honest partnership. Said he needed someone with sense enough to work hard at something that mattered. I wrote back and told him exactly who I was, my age, my history, my situation. He wrote back and said, "Come." She looked at Hector steadily. "So I came. And now you're standing here with $40 and a return ticket, and I want to know what changed." Hector turned his hat over once in his hands. "He didn't give me the full reason, ma'am. Men like Caleb Whitfield don't hand out explanations as a general rule." Men like Caleb Whitfield. She let that sit for a moment. "Private," she said. "Keeps to himself." Decided somewhere along the way that silence was the same as safety. Hector stared at her. "You've never met him." "No," Eleanor said, "but I've met men who carry that particular wound before." She adjusted her grip on the suitcase. "Is there a hotel in this town?" "The Calloway House, just down the—" "Thank you, Mr. Vargas." She walked 11 steps before her legs started shaking. She didn't stop walking. Ruth Calloway had the kind of face that had been pretty once, and was now something considerably more valuable. The face of a woman who had been through the fire and come out the other side knowing exactly who she was. She took one look at Eleanor in the doorway and came around the front desk without being asked. "I know who you are," Ruth said, reaching for the suitcase. "Sit down before you fall down." Eleanor sat. "Coffee," Ruth said, pouring without asking. "Then you can tell me what you're going to do." "I don't know yet what I'm going to do." Eleanor wrapped both hands around the cup. The heat helped. "How bad is my reputation in this town already?" "Hector Vargas told 3 men at the feed store you handed the envelope back before he even made it off the platform." Ruth settled across from her. "By tomorrow morning, it'll be the whole county." A pause. "They're on your side, for what it's worth. Caleb's got friends here, but nobody who thinks what he did was right." Eleanor was quiet a moment. Then, "My husband was a doctor in Savannah. Good man. Better doctor than he was a businessman, and he knew it. And he kept practicing medicine on people who couldn't pay, because that was who he was." Her jaw tightened slightly. "He died of yellow fever 2 years ago. I was with him at the end. His family arrived 3 days after the funeral and informed me, very politely, that I had 3 weeks to vacate the house." She looked at her coffee. "I was the one who kept the practice books. I was the one who managed the supply orders and assisted in surgeries and sat up through the nights when he had a patient in crisis. But I was the widow with no money and no legal claim to anything he'd built. So," she lifted one shoulder, "I answered 6 advertisements. His was the only one that didn't describe a servant." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "I was a mail-order bride," she said finally. 1849. My husband lasted 4 months before he decided I had too many opinions for his taste. She gestured at the walls around them. He left me this building. Thought he was punishing me. She smiled without humor. I've been running this place for 23 years. Every woman who passes through Laramie alone, I know their story before they finish telling it, because I lived a version of it myself. She leaned forward slightly. How much money have you got? $22 and change. Ruth nodded, unsurprised. Medical training? 8 years alongside my husband. I can set bone, stitch wounds, manage fever, deliver children if I have to. Eleanor said it simply, without performance. I'm not helpless. I simply need someone to let me work. Ruth studied her for a long, serious moment. Then she said, Caleb Whitfield's got 6 men on the broken spur and no medical help closer than Cheyenne. Last month, one of his boys took a bad kick from a horse, and Caleb drove him 40 miles in the dead of night. She paused. He's also been fighting a land claim dispute for the better part of a year. Man named Victor Aldridge, lawyer, land agent, the kind of dangerous that wears a suit and smiles in church, has been filing papers on 400 acres of Caleb's North Range. Something to do with the railroad wanting the coal underneath. She watched Eleanor's face carefully. Point being, Caleb Whitfield has got more trouble coming at him than most men could handle, and he's handling it alone. And that is the kind of situation that makes a man do foolish things like send an envelope with a stranger. You're explaining him to me, Eleanor said. I'm giving you information, Ruth said. What you do with it is your business. Eleanor drank her coffee. Outside, the Laramie Street moved past the window with its ordinary afternoon noise. Boots on board sidewalk, a wagon pulling through, men's voices carrying across the dust. 1,100 miles from Savannah. $22. A return ticket she'd sent back with a stranger. I'll stay the night, she said. Think on it. Ruth nodded. Rooms at the top of the stairs. Supper's at 6. She rose to take Eleanor's cup, and then paused, her hand on the table. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I think you already know what you're going to do. I think you knew before you finished handing back that envelope. She looked at Eleanor directly. Women like us don't come 1,100 miles to turn around. We come 1,100 miles because something in us knew, before we even bought the ticket, that whatever was waiting at the other end was worth the risk. Eleanor didn't answer, but she didn't disagree. Caleb Whitfield came into Laramie the following morning for supplies he could have sent Hector to fetch, and he knew it, and he came anyway. He told himself it was the feed account. He'd been telling himself convenient things his whole adult life, and he was very good at it by now. He was at the feed store counter when he heard her voice through the open door. Clear, unhurried, southern, talking to someone with a calm that had a kind of iron in it underneath. He didn't go to the window. He signed the order. He thanked the clerk. He walked out the front door and directly into Eleanor Hargrove, who was standing 3 feet away discussing laundry wages with the seamstress, and who turned at the sound of the door and looked at him with eyes that were completely and utterly unsurprised. Mr. Whitfield, she said. The seamstress went still. A man on the opposite boardwalk slowed his pace considerably. Caleb had braced himself for tears, or anger, or the particular wounded dignity of a woman wronged who wanted to make certain he felt it. Eleanor Hargrove looked at him the way a field surgeon looks at a wound, assessing, precise, already forming a plan. Mrs. Hargrove, he said. You came to town, she said. Your foreman told me you settled your feed account by mail. He said nothing. You came to see what I'd done, she said. Whether I'd gone quietly. She tilted her head slightly. I reckon you're disappointed. I'm not disappointed. The words came out more honest than he'd intended. Then what are you? He looked at her. Really looked, the way he hadn't let himself look at the photograph she'd sent, because looking too long at something you were about to lose was a particular kind of cruelty he'd learned to protect himself from. And what he saw was a woman who had been through the fire so recently that the edges of her were still slightly scorched, and who was standing in the middle of a public street in a town that wasn't hers and holding herself like she owned the ground under her feet. I behaved badly, he said, sending Hector instead of coming myself. That was wrong, and I don't have a good excuse for it. No, Eleanor agreed. You don't. Silence. The seamstress had retreated tactfully into her shop. The man across the street had found somewhere else to be. Are you afraid, Mr. Whitfield? Something went very still in his chest. Not offense, not anger. The particular stillness of a man who has just been seen clearly by someone who had no right to see him that clearly, this fast, and who doesn't know yet whether to run or hold his ground. Because it's all right if you are, Eleanor said. Her voice had dropped, not gentle exactly, but quieter, meant only for him. I've been afraid since I left Savannah. I'm afraid right now, standing here in front of you. And I'm doing it anyway, because I don't have the luxury of running from hard things. She paused. I don't think you do either. I think somewhere along the way, you decided that silence was safer than risk. That if you didn't let anything close enough to matter, nothing could take it from you. Her eyes stayed level on his. I understand that, I do. But I didn't come 1,100 miles to be managed from a safe distance, Mr. Whitfield. And I don't think that's actually what you want either, or you wouldn't be standing here right now. Caleb Whitfield had not been spoken to that directly in 6 years. He didn't have a ready answer for it. His jaw tightened. His hand moved toward his hat brim and stopped. You don't know me, he said. No, Eleanor said. That was rather the point of the arrangement. The silence that followed had weight to it. The kind of weight that means something is about to go one way or the other and won't be coming back. I need a housekeeper, Caleb said. The words came out rough, like he was pulling them up from somewhere they'd been lodged for a while. And someone with medical training, after what happened to Billy last month. 3 months. Room and board, $35 a month. Your own quarters with a lock. At the end of 3 months, you take your wages and go wherever suits you. Or we talk about what comes next. He paused. It's not what we agreed to. No, Eleanor said. It isn't. But it's honest. And I'll pay you more than you'd get anywhere else in this territory. I want the account books, Eleanor said. The real ones, not a summary. And if your men are sick or hurt, I handle it without argument. Fine. And I eat at the table with the household. Fine. And if you decide 6 weeks from now that I'm not what you expected and you want to send me off with another envelope, she said, and her voice went very quiet and very clear, you come tell me yourself, to my face, like a man who respects the person he's dealing with. Something moved across Caleb's face then. Not offense, not irritation, but something rawer than either. Something that looked, briefly, like shame doing its actual work on a man instead of just passing through. You have my word, he said. Eleanor studied him for one long moment. She was reading him the way she'd learned to read patients. Not what they said, but what their body did when they said it. Caleb Whitfield's hands were still. His eyes didn't move away. His shoulders carried the specific tension of a man who was used to bearing weight alone and had forgotten what it felt like to put any of it down. She'd treated men like that before. She knew the prognosis. Difficult. Slow. And worth it if the foundation underneath was sound. All right, she said. I'll need an hour to collect my things from Mrs. Calloway's. Caleb nodded once. "I'll be at the feed store." He walked away without another word. She watched him go. Hector appeared from the direction of the general store a moment later, arms full of paper packages, taking in the scene with the expression of a man who has witnessed something he'd stopped expecting. "He came this morning," Hector said quietly. "Told me he needed to settle the feed account in person." He shifted his packages. "That account ain't been settled in person in 3 years." He glanced at her sideways. "He came to see you, Mrs. Hargrove. He just didn't have the words for it yet." Eleanor considered that. "Is he a good man or a difficult one?" Hector answered without hesitation. "Both, in about equal measure. But the good part's bigger than the difficult part, once you get past the wall he keeps around it." He looked at her seriously. "He's got real trouble coming, too. That business with Aldridge and the North Range, it ain't going away. Men like Aldridge don't file papers and then back down. He escalates." A pause. "Caleb's going to need someone in that house who can think straight when everything goes sideways. He's been running that place alone too long to see what he's missing." Eleanor picked up her suitcase. "I've been thinking straight in sideways situations for 8 years, Mr. Vargas. I expect I can manage one more." She went to find Ruth Calloway, and as she walked, she was already cataloging what she knew. A ranch with 6 men and no medical support. Books that hadn't been properly kept. A land dispute with a lawyer who played long games. A man who ran from closeness but showed up anyway, twice, when he could have stayed away. A foreman with more loyalty than his employer probably deserved, and the honesty to tell her things Caleb wouldn't. Ruth held her at the door of the Calloway house. Brief, fierce, the embrace of a woman who understood exactly what Eleanor was walking toward. "You know where I am," Ruth said. "If it goes wrong, you come straight back." "It won't go wrong." Eleanor said it not as reassurance, but as intention. The way you say a thing when you've decided it's true and are prepared to make it so. Ruth laughed softly. "You don't know that yet." "No," Eleanor said, "but I've stopped letting that stop me." She climbed into Hector's wagon. The road north stretched out ahead of her, rutted and long, the Wyoming sky immense above it, in a way that made everything beneath it feel small. Fear, grief, the 1,100 miles of uncertainty behind her. Caleb Whitfield rode ahead on a dark horse and didn't speak. Eleanor sat straight in the wagon bed with her suitcase at her feet, and her $22, and her 8 years of hard-won skill, and her absolute refusal to be less than the sum of what she'd survived. And she watched the mountains come closer, and felt something shift quietly in her chest. Not hope, not yet. Something older and more reliable than hope. The knowledge that she had been through the worst of it, and was still here, still moving, still choosing every single day to be someone the morning could count on. The Broken Spur Ranch waited ahead of her somewhere in the long Wyoming afternoon. Whatever it held, whatever came next, she would meet it the way she'd met everything else. On her feet, eyes open, ready. The Broken Spur Ranch had the look of a place that had been loved once, and was waiting, without much patience, to be loved again. Eleanor saw it first as a shape against the late afternoon sky. The main house, long and low, built from timber and stone by hands that had known what they were doing, surrounded by outbuildings that were solid if not pretty. A barn that had been repaired in 3 different decades by the evidence of its lumber. A creek ran somewhere behind the property. She could hear it before she could see it. Hector pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the main house and climbed down. Caleb had ridden ahead and dismounted already, standing with his reins in his hand and the specific stillness of a man who wasn't sure what came next and had decided to wait it out. Eleanor climbed down before either of them could help her. She stood in front of the house and looked at it the way she'd looked at every new situation in the last 2 years. There, instead of what she wished was. The porch needed work. 2 boards on the left side had gone soft. The windows were clean enough, which surprised her. The front door had been painted at some point within living memory and still held most of its color. "It's solid," she said. Caleb looked at her. "Most people lead with the porch boards." "The porch boards can be fixed. Solid can't be built after the fact." She picked up her suitcase. "I'd like to see the house." He held the door and she walked through it, and for the next 20 minutes she moved through the rooms without commentary, while Caleb followed at a slight distance, and Hector diplomatically found somewhere else to be. The kitchen was functional and chaotic in equal measure. Good bones, wrong organization. The kind of disorder that accumulates when capable people are too busy to impose order on anything beyond what's strictly necessary. The main room had a fireplace that drew well by the look of the ash pattern and furniture that had been chosen for durability rather than comfort, and had achieved both. A study off the main room had bookshelves that ran floor to ceiling on 2 walls, and Eleanor stopped in the doorway of that room long enough to read a dozen spines and recalibrate something in her assessment of the man standing behind her. "The cook's quarters are off the kitchen," Caleb said. "I had Hector air it out this morning." "You knew I was coming this morning." A pause. "I thought you might." She didn't push it. She went to look at the cook's quarters. Small, clean, a window facing east, a lock on the door that was newer than anything else in the room. He'd replaced the lock. She noted that and said nothing. "The men eat at 6, Caleb said from the doorway. "I usually just—" "I'll cook," Eleanor said. He stopped. "You don't have to start tonight. You just arrived. You could—" "Mr. Whitfield." She turned to face him. "You hired me to work. I intend to work. That's not a performance of capability, it's just the arrangement." She set her suitcase on the bed. "What's in the pantry?" What was in the pantry was a reliable argument for the proposition that 6 men left to their own devices for 3 months would subsist on anything that required no skill to prepare. Eleanor looked at it for a moment, made several decisions, and went to work. She had biscuits in the oven and salt pork on the stove when the ranch hands came in at 6 o'clock. They came through the kitchen door in a loose cluster and stopped as one when they saw her, with the synchronized surprise of men who had been told something was coming and still weren't prepared for the reality of it. Hector made the introductions. Billy Frost was the youngest, 18 or 19, sunburned and wiry, with a kind of energy that hadn't yet learned to be careful with itself. He grinned at Eleanor like she was Christmas morning. "You're real," he said. "Last I checked," Eleanor said. "Sit down, all of you. Food's almost ready." They sat. Caleb came in last and took the chair at the head of the table without comment. And Eleanor noted that no one competed for that chair, or looked surprised that he took it, which told her something about how the household operated. The meal that followed was the most noise the Broken Spur kitchen had produced in months, judging by the way the men ate and talked with the specific relief of people who have been too quiet for too long. They asked Eleanor questions: where she was from, how she'd come to be here, whether she'd ever seen a cattle drive. And she answered honestly and asked questions back. And by the time the biscuits were gone, the room had settled into something that felt, cautiously, like ease. Caleb said almost nothing through all of it. He ate, he listened. Once, when Billy asked Eleanor something that edged too close to the circumstances of her arrival, Caleb said, "That's enough, Billy," in a tone that closed the subject without cruelty. And Billy closed it, and the conversation moved on. Eleanor caught Caleb's eye across the table and gave him the smallest nod. He looked back at his plate. After supper, the men drifted toward the bunkhouse, and Eleanor cleared the table alone. She could feel Caleb still in the room. He'd stayed when the others left, which she didn't think was his habit. And she waited him out, washing dishes with the methodical patience she'd developed over years of waiting for patients to say the thing they'd come to say. "You didn't have to do that," he said finally. "Shut Billy down." "I know. You did it." "You'd have handled it yourself." "Yes," Eleanor said. "But you handled it for me, which meant something different." She set a clean plate on the shelf. "It meant the men understood that my business is my business, and you intend to keep it that way. That would have taken me considerably longer to establish on my own." Another silence. Caleb was quiet in a way that wasn't empty. She'd noticed that already, in the wagon and on the street, and now here. He thought before he spoke, and when he spoke, he meant it. And in Eleanor's experience, that was a combination so rare, it was almost startling. "I want to look at the account books," she said. "Not tonight, tomorrow, when I've had time to understand the household first. But I want to understand the full picture, including the Aldridge dispute." The air in the room changed slightly. "Ruth told you about that," Caleb said. "Ruth told me enough to know it's serious, and that you're handling it alone, and that it involves a man who is considerably more dangerous than the kind that announce themselves." She dried her hands and turned to face him. "I'm not asking to take it over. I'm asking to understand it. I was my husband's bookkeeper for 8 years, and before that, my father kept me in his office while he managed his business because he said the best education a girl could have was understanding how money actually worked." She paused. "I can read a legal document, Mr. Whitfield. I can find the inconsistency in a land survey faster than most lawyers can, because I'm not looking for what should be there. I'm looking for what's wrong." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "Aldridge has been filing on 400 acres of my North Range," he said. "Claims his client holds a prior deed that supersedes my father's original homestead plan. My lawyer says the paperwork looks legitimate on the surface." His jaw tightened. "It's not. I know this land. My father broke this ground. But knowing something and proving it are two different problems." "What does your lawyer say about the survey records?" "That they match the deed Aldridge filed. In the original homestead paperwork, your father's claim? Filed in 1861, Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne." "Has your lawyer seen the original? Not a copy. The original document with the office stamp and the filing date?" Caleb went still. He reviewed the file. "The file your lawyer holds, or the original record at the land office?" A longer pause. "I don't know," Caleb said. And she could hear in those 3 words the specific frustration of a man who is very competent at the things he knows, and has just realized he may have trusted someone else with something he should have verified himself. "That's where I'd start," Eleanor said. "Tomorrow, if you'll let me see what you have." He didn't answer immediately. She waited. "Why?" he said. "I beg your pardon?" "Why does it matter to you? You've been here 4 hours. This isn't your ranch. The arrangement gives you no stake in whether Aldridge wins or loses." He wasn't suspicious exactly. He was genuinely asking. The way a man asks when he's been disappointed enough times to need to understand the reason before he accepts the thing being offered. "Why does it matter?" Eleanor considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "Because you offered me work when you could have let me leave," she said. "Because Hector Vargas is one of the most honest men I've met in 2 years, and he has chosen to give his loyalty to this place, which tells me the place deserves it. Because those men at your table tonight are working hard for someone they trust, and that kind of trust takes time to build and doesn't survive being destroyed." She paused. "And because Victor Aldridge is the kind of man who has been doing this to families in this territory for years, and somebody ought to be paying attention to the right details. She picked up the dish towel. That's enough reasons, I reckon. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's coffee if you want it. I usually take mine in the study." It was not, Eleanor understood, a grand gesture. It was a man who had made a wall so high he'd forgotten what it felt like to open a door, cracking one open about an inch and waiting to see if the world fell in. "I'd like that," she said. They sat in the study for the better part of an hour, Caleb on one side of the desk and Eleanor on the other, and he walked her through the land dispute in the terse, efficient way of someone who had been carrying a problem alone long enough that laying it out for someone else felt both relieving and dangerously vulnerable. Eleanor listened and asked questions and took notes on the scrap of paper she found on the corner of his desk. And by the time the coffee was finished, she had identified 3 points in his documentation that needed immediate verification. She didn't tell him what she thought about the overall picture yet, not because she didn't have an opinion. She had a very clear opinion, but because some things needed to be established slowly, and trust between two people who had every reason to be careful of each other was one of them. It was Caleb who ended the evening. He stood, gathered his papers, and said, "You should get some rest. The mornings start early here." "I'm aware," Eleanor said, rising. "I was awake before you this morning." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but the cousin of one. "I know. I heard you." She paused. "You heard me? In the hotel?" "I rode past on my way out of town." He said it without embarrassment, as though it were simply information. "Saw the light in your room, 5:30 in the morning." He picked up his coffee cup. "I thought, a woman who can't sleep before she walks into an uncertain situation and gets up before dawn anyway, instead of lying there feeling sorry for herself. That's..." He stopped. "That's what?" Eleanor said. "That's someone worth making room for." He said it quietly, looking at the cup rather than at her. "I should have come to the platform myself. I should have said that to you in person, instead of sending an envelope. I was..." He stopped again, started again, differently. "I wasn't afraid of you, Mrs. Hargrove. I was afraid of what it would mean if you were exactly what your letters suggested, because then I'd have to decide what to do about it, and I've been alone long enough that deciding felt harder than avoiding." The room was very quiet. Eleanor understood, with the clarity that came from having her own version of that same wound, that this was not a man making a speech. This was a man saying the truest thing he knew how to say, in the only register available to him, which was plain and short, and stripped of anything decorative. "I know what that feels like," she said. "The deciding." He looked up then. "I stayed in Savannah 8 months longer than I needed to after Robert died," she said. "Told myself I was settling the estate, managing the debts, being responsible. And I was doing all of those things." She met his eyes steadily. "But I was also not deciding. Because deciding meant admitting the life I'd built was over, and I'd have to build a different one. And that was the most frightening thing I'd ever considered." She paused. "Then one morning I woke up and thought, you can be afraid of starting, or you can be afraid of staying exactly where you are forever. And staying is the worst kind of afraid, because it doesn't even have the possibility of something good on the other side of it." Caleb set his cup down. "So I answered 6 advertisements," Eleanor said. "And I got on a train, and here I am." "Here you are," Caleb said. The next morning she was in the kitchen at 5 o'clock and found Hector already there, hands wrapped around a tin cup, staring out the window with the expression of a man conducting an argument with himself. "He slept," Hector said without turning around. Eleanor paused. "I beg your pardon?" "Caleb. He slept last night." Hector turned then, and his expression was complicated. "He doesn't sleep, Mrs. Hargrove. Hasn't, not properly, since I've known him. You can hear him some nights, pacing or out in the barn at 2 in the morning, because he'd rather be doing something than lying in the dark. He looked at her steadily. He slept last night. I heard him this morning, which means he didn't hear himself not sleeping. A pause. I don't know what you said to him, but whatever it was, thank you. Eleanor didn't know what to do with that. She put the coffee on. She was pulling biscuits from the oven an hour later, when she heard the commotion from the barn. A shout, then a thud. Then Billy Frost's voice, rising high and sharp above the ordinary morning noise. She was already moving when Hector hit the kitchen door. "Billy," he said, "the gray mare got loose in the barn. Kicked him before he got clear." Eleanor was out the door before he finished the sentence, the dish towel still in her hand. She went through the barn door and found Billy on the ground with Tom kneeling over him, and 2 of the other hands standing back because there was nothing useful they could do, and they knew it. Billy was conscious. That was the first thing she checked. His face was the color of old chalk, and he was breathing in the careful, shallow way of someone who has discovered that deeper hurts considerably more. But his eyes were open and tracking. "Billy," she said, dropping to her knees beside him. "Look at me. Right here." His eyes found hers. "Tell me where it hurts the most." "Ribs," he said. The word came out in pieces. "Left side. And my arm, I think Don't move the arm." She ran her hands along his left side with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, reading the damage through her fingertips. He flinched hard at the 4th rib. She pressed again, gently, and he made a sound that told her everything she needed to know. 2 ribs, possibly 3, she said. Not to Billy, to the room. "Left side. The arm is likely fractured at the ulna. I need to look at it properly in better light, but that's my read." She sat back on her heels and looked at Tom. "I need clean cloth, a flat board about this length," she measured with her hands, "and someone to help me get him up slowly, without twisting." "I've got him." Caleb was there. She hadn't heard him come in. He crouched on Billy's other side and put a steady hand on the young man's shoulder. "Easy, Billy. We're going to go slow." "I don't reckon slow is going to feel much better than fast," Billy said through gritted teeth. "Probably not," Caleb agreed. "Do it anyway." They got him to the main house and onto the kitchen table, and Eleanor worked for the better part of an hour, splinting the arm and binding the ribs and talking to Billy in the level, continuous voice she'd used with patients in the worst of it. Not reassurance exactly, because false reassurance insulted people's intelligence, but the steadying presence of someone who had seen this before and was not alarmed by it. Caleb stood at the edge of the room and watched her work. When it was done, and Billy was settled, and the arm was bound, and his color was coming back, Eleanor washed her hands at the basin and became aware that the kitchen was very quiet. She turned and found all 5 of the other men in the doorway, watching her with the particular expression of people who have just witnessed something that has rearranged their understanding of the situation. "He'll need to stay off that arm for 3 weeks, she said. "The ribs will hurt for 6. He can do light work after 2 weeks if he doesn't do anything foolish." She looked at Billy. "Which means you, specifically, need to develop a better relationship with the concept of patience." Billy Frost, pale and splinted and propped against a rolled blanket, managed a grin that was mostly genuine. "Yes, ma'am." Hector caught Eleanor's eye from the doorway and gave her a single, small nod. She turned back to the basin. Behind her, she heard Caleb say, quietly, to no one in particular and everyone at once, "Get back to work." And then, quieter still, not meant to carry, but it carried anyway, because she was listening, because she'd been listening to what this man said and didn't say since the moment he walked out of a feed store and couldn't quite walk away. "She stays." 2 words. The whole barn crew heard them. Eleanor heard them. She kept washing her hands and said nothing, and felt something settle in her chest, like a stone finding the bottom of still water. Not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet certainty of a thing that has found the place it was always meant to be. 3 weeks passed the way hard work passes, not slowly, not quickly, but with the particular density of days that are too full to feel wasted. Eleanor learned the rhythm of the broken spur, the way she'd learned everything in her life, by paying attention to what nobody thought to explain, because those were always the things that mattered most. She learned that Hector arrived in the kitchen 12 minutes before anyone else every morning. Not because he was an early riser by nature, but because he liked the quiet before the day made its demands. She learned that Tom had a bad knee from an old fall that he never mentioned, and that she could tell was troubling him by the way he came downstairs on cold mornings. She learned that the youngest hand, a quiet boy named Cord, who had barely said 10 words to her in 3 weeks, left a small bunch of whatever wildflowers were surviving the September cold on the kitchen windowsill every Monday morning, without acknowledgement or explanation, and that if she said nothing about it, he kept doing it. So she said nothing about it. She learned that Caleb Whitfield read until midnight most nights, that he took his coffee black and his opinions straight, and that the wall he kept around himself had a door in it that he occasionally forgot to close all the way. Those were the moments she cataloged most carefully. Not because she was looking for something. She told herself she wasn't looking for something. But because understanding a person required understanding what they looked like when they weren't performing the version of themselves they decided was safe to show. Caleb forgot to close the door when they were working on the account books together. He'd started letting her into the study every evening after supper, initially with the slightly wary formality of a man allowing a stranger into a room he considered private, and then with something that stopped being formality and became simply habit. He would spread the papers on the desk, and she would pull the second chair around to his side because it was more efficient than reading everything sideways. And they would work, and somewhere in the working, the space between them would go from careful to comfortable, without either of them deciding it. It was during one of those evenings, 10 days into her time at the ranch, that Eleanor found the first problem. She had been working through the territorial land records Caleb's lawyer had provided. Copies, not originals, which was itself a problem she was filing away. When she found a survey date that didn't align with the chain of title Aldridge was claiming. "Look at this," she said, and slid the paper across the desk. Caleb leaned forward. His shoulder was close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of him, which she was in the habit of not noticing, or at least of noticing and immediately filing under things not relevant to the current task. "The survey Aldridge filed is dated April 1859, she said. "But the deed he's using to establish his client's prior claim is dated March 1859. She put her finger on the line. "A survey has to precede a deed, Mr. Whitfield. You cannot legally deed land that hasn't been surveyed." If this survey date is accurate, the deed is impossible. The deed would have been written 1 month before the land it describes was legally measured. Caleb was very still for a moment. That could be a clerical error, a wrong date on a copy. "It could be," Eleanor said, "which is why I need the original survey document from the territorial office, not this copy." She sat back. But if the original says April 1859, then the entire foundation of Aldridge's claim is fraudulent. Not contested, fraudulent. Provably, demonstrably fraudulent. Caleb looked at the paper for a long time. Then he said, "My lawyer has had these documents for 4 months." "Yes," Eleanor said, "and he didn't see this. He may have seen it and not understood its significance. Or—" She paused, choosing her words the way she chose everything, carefully, with full awareness of the weight they carried. "Or he didn't look closely enough." which is a different kind of problem. Caleb pushed back from the desk and stood. He walked to the window and stood there with his hands at his sides. And Eleanor recognized the particular posture of a man whose anger was not the hot kind, but the cold kind. The kind that comes from realizing you trusted someone who did not deserve it, and that the failure was partly your own for trusting. "I need to go to Cheyenne," he said. "Yes. The original documents, the land office records." "And your lawyer's file," Eleanor said. "Not a copy of his file, the file itself, every document in it, in the order he received them." She paused. "I'd like to go with you, if you'll allow it. I know what I'm looking for now. I can move through the records faster than someone who's seeing the pattern for the first time." Caleb turned from the window. He looked at her with an expression she was becoming able to read. Not easily, because he was not an easy man to read, but with the increasing accuracy that came from 3 weeks of close attention. This was the expression that meant he was weighing something that went beyond the practical question being asked. "It's a 2-day ride to Cheyenne," he said. "There and back. I'm aware of how far Cheyenne is. You'd be away from the ranch, away from Billy. Billy is healing well, and Hector can manage 2 days." She met his eyes. "You're not worried about Billy, Mr. Whitfield?" A pause. "No," he said. "I'm not." "Then say the actual thing." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "People will talk." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "People in this territory are watching a man lose 400 acres of his family's land to a fraudulent deed, while his lawyer apparently can't find his way through a chain of title. I reckon that's a more pressing concern than what they say about a rancher and his housekeeper riding to Cheyenne on ranch business." She paused. "But if it troubles you, Ruth Calloway would come. She'd want to know what we found anyway." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but related to one. "You already thought of that?" "I think ahead," Eleanor said. "It's a habit." He nodded once. "We leave day after tomorrow. I'll send word to Ruth." She was almost to the kitchen door when he said, "Eleanor?" It was the first time he'd used her given name. She stopped. "Thank you," he said. It came out the way things came out of Caleb Whitfield when they were genuine. Plain, undecorated, carrying more weight than its syllables suggested. "You're welcome," she said, and went to bed, and lay awake longer than she'd intended, which she attributed entirely to the Aldridge problem, and not to anything else at all. Ruth came. She arrived the morning of the ride to Cheyenne, with a carpetbag and the cheerful efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this development. And she and Eleanor sat together in the wagon, while Caleb and Hector rode alongside, and Ruth talked about Laramie and the territory and the history of the broken spur, with the easy conversational generosity of someone who understood that information was a form of welcome. "His father built that ranch from nothing," Ruth said, her voice low enough that it didn't carry to the riders. "Jedediah Whitfield came out from Missouri in 1858 with $40 and a horse that died 2 weeks after he arrived. Filed his homestead claim on foot." She glanced at Eleanor. "Caleb came back from the war in '65 and found his father had kept the place going through everything. Drought, Apache raids, 2 bad winters in a row. Kept it by sheer stubbornness." A pause. "Caleb's wife left in '72. I think you know that." "He hasn't spoken of her." "He wouldn't. Her name was Catherine, and she wasn't a bad person. I want to be clear about that. She was a woman who needed more than silence and hard seasons, and Caleb couldn't give her what she needed, and she left. And he has spent the years since then deciding that the leaving was proof of something about himself that couldn't be changed." Ruth's voice was matter-of-fact, not unkind. "It wasn't. But you can't tell a man that. He has to find it out himself, or it doesn't hold. Eleanor said nothing. She watched the road ahead and was aware of Caleb's silhouette against the gray morning sky. The straight back, the easy way he sat a horse, the specific quality of his stillness that she had spent 3 weeks trying to decide was solitude or loneliness, and had concluded was both, in proportions that shifted depending on the day. The land office in Cheyenne was a low building that smelled of paper and damp, and the particular mustiness of records that hold more consequence than their appearance suggests. Eleanor had been in rooms like this before. Her husband's county records office, the probate court in Savannah, where she'd spent 3 terrible days after Robert's death. And she'd learned in those rooms that the only way to find what you were looking for was to start from the beginning and trust nothing that wasn't original. The clerk was a thin young man with ink on his fingers, who became considerably more cooperative when Caleb put the territorial registration number of his father's claim on the counter and asked to see the original filing. He disappeared into the back and returned with a folder that had the particular weight of something that had been sitting undisturbed for a long time. Eleanor opened it carefully. She read every page before she spoke. "The original homestead claim," she said. "Filed October 14th, 1861. Territorial stamp. Original ink. Registrar's signature." She turned to the survey document attached. "Survey date?" She looked up at Caleb. "September 3rd, 1861. 6 weeks before the claim filing," Caleb said. "As it should be." She set it down. "Now I need to see the original of the survey Aldridge used in his filing." That took longer. The clerk was less certain where that document lived, and while he searched, Eleanor sat across from Caleb at the small table the office provided for reviewing records, and they waited in the specific silence of 2 people who have something significant to say to each other, and have agreed, without discussing it, that this is not the moment. The clerk returned with a second folder. Eleanor opened it. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she put it flat on the table between her and Caleb and pointed to the date. April 7th, 1859. "Now," she said, "I need to see the deed Aldridge is basing his claim on." The deed was in a third file. Eleanor looked at it for a long time without speaking. Caleb watched her face. "March 22nd, 1859, she said. 6 weeks before the survey, Caleb said, which means the deed describes land that hadn't been legally surveyed when the deed was written. Eleanor sat back. Which means the deed is fraudulent. Not mistaken, not contested. Fraudulent. Someone wrote a deed for land they hadn't surveyed and backdated or falsified the survey to cover it. She looked at Caleb. And your lawyer either didn't catch it or didn't want to. The room was very quiet. Aldridge has a man inside the process, Caleb said. It wasn't a question. That would be my read, Eleanor said carefully. I can't prove that, but the discrepancy is not subtle. Any competent lawyer reviewing these documents would have found it within an hour. She paused. Your lawyer has had 4 months. Caleb stood. He walked to the window of the small office and stood there, and Eleanor waited, because she'd learned that Caleb Whitfield needed a moment when the thing he was being told was the kind of thing that required rearranging what you thought you knew. I trusted him, Caleb said. Harlan Beck. He handled my father's estate. He's been in Laramie 20 years. I know, Eleanor said. Which means either he's incompetent or he's working for the other side. Yes, Eleanor said. And from what I've seen, he is not incompetent. Another silence. Caleb turned from the window. His face was controlled in the way she'd come to recognize as his specific form of anger. Not explosive, but contained, and therefore more dangerous in a certain sense, because it didn't spend itself on noise. We need a different lawyer, he said. Someone who isn't connected to Beck or to Aldridge. There's a man in Cheyenne, Ruth said from the doorway. She'd been standing there for a while, Eleanor realized. Quiet enough not to intrude, close enough not to miss anything. James Carey. He took on a land fraud case 2 years ago against a railroad agent and won. Honest man. Doesn't owe anybody in Laramie a favor. She paused. I know his wife from the Presbyterian Ladies' Society. I can get you an appointment today if you want one. Caleb looked at Ruth for a moment. You've been thinking about this longer than today, he said. I've been thinking about it since Aldridge filed the first paper, Ruth said. I just needed someone to find the evidence before I said anything, because a suspicion without proof is just gossip, and I don't deal in gossip. She looked at Eleanor. But a date discrepancy in original territorial records is not a suspicion. James Carey was a compact, precise man of 50, who listened to Eleanor lay out the documentation with the focused attention of someone who understood what he was hearing and was calibrating its significance in real time. She walked him through the survey dates, the deed dates, the chain of title, and the 4 months of inaction from Harlan Beck. She put the copy she'd made, the clerk had allowed her to take careful notes, on his desk in the order she'd found them, and she explained the pattern without dramatizing it, because the facts were dramatic enough on their own. When she finished, Carey was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Where did you find her? He said. She found me, Caleb said. Carey looked back at Eleanor. This is a solid case. The date discrepancy alone is enough to challenge the claim. With Beck's inaction as a secondary issue, he paused. I'd want to look at the original documents myself before I make any promises. But if they read the way you've described, we can file a motion to dismiss Aldridge's claim within 2 weeks and have a hearing before the territorial court within 60 days. He folded his hands on the desk. I'll want depositions. I'll want testimony from anyone who has knowledge of the original homestead being worked and occupied. And I'll want you to say nothing to Beck or Aldridge about any of this until I've had time to review the full file. Understood, Caleb said. One more thing. Carey looked at Eleanor. Are you willing to testify to what you found here? Your reading of the documents, the process you used, your conclusions? Eleanor didn't hesitate. Yes. Carey nodded. Then I think Mr. Whitfield's chances are considerably better today than they were this morning. They rode back toward Laramie in the late afternoon light, and for the first mile, nobody said much of anything, which was its own kind of conversation. Ruth had ridden ahead. She had business in Laramie in the morning and needed the evening to prepare. And Eleanor and Caleb were alone on the road in a way they hadn't been before. And the silence between them was different from the silences she'd grown accustomed to in the study or at the table. It was the silence of two people who have done something together that mattered, and are sitting with the weight of it. You knew before we left, Caleb said, that Beck was the problem. I suspected, Eleanor said. I didn't know until I saw the original documents. But you suspected. Yes. Why didn't you say so? Eleanor considered the road ahead for a moment. Because suspicion without evidence doesn't help you. It just gives you something else to be angry about before you're ready to do anything with the anger. She paused. You needed the documents first, the emotions second. In that order, it's useful. The other way around, it just burns. Caleb was quiet. The horses moved at an easy pace, hooves steady on the packed earth. Catherine used to say I handled things backward, he said. Said I managed the practical and ignored the emotional until the emotional became a crisis. It was the first time he'd said her name to Eleanor. She kept her voice level. Do you think she was right? I think... He stopped, started again. I think she wasn't wrong. I think I told myself that if I took care of the ranch and the men and the practical business of keeping things alive, the rest would take care of itself. A pause. It didn't. It rarely does, Eleanor said. You didn't do that today. You managed both. The practical, the documents, the dates, laying it all out for Carrie. And he seemed to search for the word. The human part of it. Understanding that I needed to know what we were dealing with before I could hear what it meant. He glanced at her. How did you learn that? The same way you learn most things that matter, Eleanor said. From watching people I loved go through things that were too hard, and trying to figure out how to help without making it worse. She paused. My husband was a good doctor and a frightened man. He was afraid all the time, afraid he'd miss something, afraid he'd make the wrong call, afraid that if he let himself feel the weight of a patient's suffering, he'd stop being able to function. I learned to give him the practical things first, because that's where he felt competent, and then wait for the space where the other things could come. She was quiet for a moment. He was a good man. He just needed someone who understood how he was built. Caleb didn't say anything for a long while. The sky was darkening ahead of them, the first stars coming through, and the road was beginning to feel familiar in the way roads feel when you know where they lead. Eleanor, he said. She waited. I owe you more than a housekeeper's wages. You owe me exactly what we agreed, she said. Nothing more. That's not... He stopped. Tried again. What you did today, what you've done these 3 weeks, it's not what I hired you for. It's not something I can put in a ledger. He looked at her directly, and in the dusk his expression was the most unguarded she'd seen it. I don't know how to... I'm not practiced at this. Saying the thing. He said it with a frustration that was entirely honest. I'm better at doing it than saying it. I know, Eleanor said. Then you know that when I say it matters, you matter. I mean it in a way that... He stopped again. Eleanor looked at him. The wall was still there. She could see it. But there was a window in it now that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. And through the window, she could see clearly enough. Caleb, she said. She used his name deliberately, the way he'd used hers, as a door rather than a formality. I know. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked back at the road. They rode in silence the rest of the way, and it was the best kind of silence. The kind that doesn't need to be filled, because what's in it is already enough. What Eleanor didn't say, because the moment wasn't right for it yet, was that she'd been thinking about the woman who left. About Catherine, who had needed more than this man could give, and had gone looking for it elsewhere. About the way Caleb carried that leaving like a verdict rather than a circumstance. She'd been thinking about it because she wanted to understand it, not to fix it. She'd learned young that you couldn't fix what a person had decided was true about themselves. Not by argument, not by reassurance, not by anything except the slow accumulation of evidence that the verdict was wrong. That took time. That took staying. Eleanor Hargrove had nowhere else to be, and for the first time since she'd left Savannah, that fact felt not like a limitation, but like a choice. Victor Aldridge came to the Broken Spur on a Tuesday morning, and he came alone, which was how Eleanor knew he was the most dangerous kind of man. Dangerous men who needed backup announced their danger before they opened their mouths. Aldridge didn't need backup. He arrived on a good horse with clean boots and a smile that had been practiced in a mirror until it looked natural. And he asked for Caleb Whitfield with the easy confidence of someone who had never seriously considered the possibility of being turned away. Caleb was out on the North Range with Hector, checking fence. I've heard a great deal about you, Mrs. Hargrove. A woman with your particular skills coming all this way. It's quite a story. Most lives are, Eleanor said. What's your message, Mr. Aldridge? Something shifted in his eyes. Not the smile. The smile stayed where it was. But behind it, a recalibration. He'd expected something different from her. Nervousness, perhaps. Deference. The instinctive female retreat that men like him had learned to count on. "I wanted to offer Mr. Whitfield an opportunity," Aldridge said. "The land matter. The North Range claim. I believe there's a resolution available that would benefit everyone involved. A fair market purchase. My client is prepared to be generous. More generous, I'd venture, than a lengthy court proceeding would ultimately prove to be." Eleanor looked at him. "Your client wants to buy land that the territorial court is about to determine was never legally his to claim?" she said. "That's not an opportunity, Mr. Aldridge. That's a retreat, dressed up as a negotiation." The smile didn't waver, but the calculation behind his eyes went very still. "You've been busy," he said. "Mr. Whitfield will have your message," Eleanor said. "Good day." She closed the door. She stood in the front room and listened to his horse leave, and she didn't move until the sound of hooves had faded completely off the property. Then she went to find pen and paper and wrote down every word of the conversation in the order it had happened, because James Carey had told them to document everything, and Eleanor Hargrove had been documenting everything since the day she'd learned that memory was fallible and paper was not. Caleb came back at midday. She gave him the written account before she said a word about it, because she'd learned that was the order that worked best for him. He read it standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat still on, and she watched his face go through the particular sequence she'd come to know. Control first, then the cold anger underneath, then the stillness that meant he was deciding. "He knows we've been to Cheyenne," Caleb said. "Yes." "Which means someone at the land office told him, or someone watching Cheyenne told him, or Beck told him." "Any of the three," Eleanor said. "But the offer means Carey's right. If Aldridge's claim were solid, he wouldn't be here trying to settle. He'd be waiting for the court date." She paused. "He's scared of what we found." Caleb set the paper on the table. "I need to wire Carey today." "I already drafted the message," Eleanor said, and set the second paper beside the first. He looked at her. For a moment the kitchen was very quiet. "Eleanor," he said. "It needs to go before afternoon," she said. "The telegraph office closes at 4. He picked up the message, read it, and nodded. "This is right." He reached for his hat. "I'll ride into town." "Caleb," she said it before she'd decided to. He stopped. "Be careful who you speak to in Laramie. If Beck is involved, his connections run wider than one office." She paused. "Trust Ruth. Trust no one else you haven't already tested." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she could never quite name, the one that lived in the space between gratitude and something considerably more complicated. "I know," he said, and then, quieter, "Thank you for being here when he came." "I live here," Eleanor said. Something crossed his face at that, swift, involuntary, a flicker of something that might have been joy if it had lasted long enough to be identified. Then he put his hat on and went, and Eleanor stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride toward the road, and told herself very firmly that she was not watching for the pleasure of watching, but only to make certain he reached the main road without incident. She did not entirely believe herself. The weeks that followed were the kind that looked quiet from the outside and were anything but. Carey filed the motion. The territorial court set a hearing date for 40 days out. Aldridge filed a counter-motion challenging the validity of the original homestead survey, which Carey had anticipated and which Eleanor helped him dismantle line by line in a 3-hour session at the Calloway house, while Ruth provided coffee and the occasional sharp observation that turned out, twice, to be exactly the right question. The ranch ran. Billy healed. His arm came out of the splint with a clean union that Eleanor had expected, but still felt a quiet satisfaction at confirming. Tom's knee got a liniment treatment she mixed herself, from supplies she'd ordered from Cheyenne, and within a week he was coming down the stairs in the morning without the careful sideways step. Hector watched these developments with the expression of a man who was keeping a running tally that he intended to present at some future date. It was Hector who came to Eleanor one evening and said in the straightforward way that was his only mode of communication, "You should know that Aldridge has been asking questions in town, about you specifically, your history in Savannah, your husband's debts." Eleanor kept her hands steady on the bread dough she was working. "What kind of questions?" "The kind a man asks when he's trying to find something he can use." Hector's voice was careful. "I don't know what he thinks he'll find, but I thought you should be the one to decide whether to tell Caleb, not me." She looked up. "You haven't told him." "Not my information to carry," he held her gaze. "But Caleb should know. Not because it changes anything. It doesn't change anything. Not for anyone on this ranch. But because Aldridge will try to use it in front of the court if he can. And a man who's blindsided in the courtroom is a man who can't think straight." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I'll tell him tonight." Hector nodded and left, and Eleanor stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands in the dough and made herself breathe through the cold that had spread through her chest. She had known, on some level, that her history was a liability. Women who arrived in new places, carrying debt and dead husbands and departed family, were always vulnerable to that history being used against them by someone with a reason to use it. She had simply hoped, as she hoped for most things, that the facts would be sufficient protection. Facts were only sufficient when the person judging them was honest. Aldridge was not honest, and the question was whether the court would be. She told Caleb after supper, when the men had gone and the kitchen was quiet, and the lamp on the table threw its particular small circle of light that made everything inside it feel both close and separate from the rest of the world. She told him plainly, the way she told him everything: Robert's practice, the patients who couldn't pay, the debts that had accumulated, not from carelessness, but from generosity, the family who had turned her out, the 3 boarding houses she'd moved through in 8 months trying to save enough to get out of Savannah entirely. She left nothing out and softened nothing, because she had learned the hard way that partial truth had a way of becoming a weapon in the hands of someone looking for an angle. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at the table rather than at her, and Eleanor waited, with the specific stillness of someone who knows that the next few seconds will tell them something important. "Does any of that change what you found in the land office?" he said. "No." "Does it change who you are?" "No." "Then it doesn't matter." He said it flatly, with finality, the way he said things he'd already decided. "Aldridge can put your history in front of the court if he wants to. A woman who managed her husband's medical practice for 8 years and kept his books and nursed his patients through the night and paid every debt she could find before she left." He stopped. "That's not a liability, Eleanor. That's a character witness." She looked at him. "That's a generous reading." "That's an accurate reading." He met her eyes. "I'm not a generous man, as a general rule. Ask anyone on this ranch." Something loosened in Eleanor's chest that she hadn't fully realized was tight. "Carrie should know," she said, "before the hearing." "I'll tell him." Caleb paused. "Unless you'd rather tell him yourself." "I'd rather tell him myself," she said. "It's my history. I'll carry it." He nodded, and then he said something that she had not expected. "I had a conversation with Beck last week." She went still. "You didn't tell me." "No." He looked at the lamp. "I went to his office to retrieve the full file. Carrie wanted the originals. Beck was—" He paused in that way he had when he was being precise about something. "He was cooperative. too cooperative. Handed everything over without argument. No delays, no questions. A man with nothing to hide doesn't hand over his file that fast. A man who knows the file is already burned and wants to look clean does. "You should have told me," Eleanor said. "I know." "Caleb?" She kept her voice level, but she let him hear what was in it. "We agreed, when we went to Cheyenne, when we started working on this together, that you would tell me things as they happened, not after you'd processed them, not when you'd decided they were relevant. As they happened." "I know," he said again. I handled it the way I handle things alone. I've been handling things alone for a long time, and the habit is—" He stopped. "It's not an excuse." "No," Eleanor said. "It isn't." The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the first silence between them that had an edge to it, and Eleanor knew it was important. Not because conflict was valuable in itself, but because this specific conflict was about the specific thing that would determine whether any of this held. Whether Caleb could learn to be in the presence of another person without retreating into himself when the information felt too close to something that mattered. "Eleanor." His voice was lower than usual. "I'm not practiced at this. I've said that before, and I know it's not enough. But I want you to understand that I'm not withholding things because I don't trust you. I'm withholding things because I'm still learning that someone else can hold them with me." A pause that cost him something. "Catherine used to say I treated her like a guest in my own life, that I'd let her close enough to see me, but not close enough to actually be there." He looked up. "I don't want to do that to you." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Then don't," she said. It was not unkind, but it was direct, and it required something from him that he would have to decide whether he could give. He held her gaze. "I told Beck, before I left his office, that we had new representation and that we'd found the date discrepancy. I wanted him to know we knew." He said it steadily, owning it completely. "It was a mistake. I was angry, and I let the anger make the decision. Carrie will say it was a mistake. I already know it was a mistake." A pause. "And I should have told you before I went. I should have told you that evening when I got back. Instead, I waited 5 days because I didn't want to have this conversation." "But you're having it now," Eleanor said. "Because you deserve it," he said. "Not because it's comfortable." Eleanor looked at him and saw something she'd been watching for without admitting she was watching for it. Not the absence of the wall, because the wall was built too deep to simply disappear, but evidence that he was choosing, deliberately and at some cost to himself, to leave the door open. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." He nodded once. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, and she could see the tension in them, the effort of remaining still rather than standing and putting distance between himself and the conversation. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "What are you afraid of?" "Not the ranch, not Aldridge, not the court. You." She held his gaze. "What is the actual thing?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "That you'll see the whole of it and decide the cost is too high." He said it looking at the lamp, not at her. Catherine saw the whole of it and decided the cost was too high. "I don't—" He stopped. "I have never asked anyone to stay before. I don't know how to ask that, and also be the reason they might want to leave." The room was very quiet. Eleanor understood now, completely, in the way you understand something when you've been looking at it from the wrong angle and suddenly see its actual shape. Why he'd sent Hector with the envelope. It wasn't cowardice, or not only cowardice. It was preemption. He'd looked at her letters, at the woman she'd described herself as being, and he'd decided, before she arrived, that the most merciful thing he could do was spare both of them the process of her discovering what she was working with. He had sent her away to protect her from him, and he had been completely, entirely wrong about what she needed protecting from. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "I am not Catherine. I know that. I'm not a woman who needs the room to be easy. I'm not a woman who leaves when things get hard." She paused. "I left Savannah, yes, but I left because there was nothing left to fight for, not because the fighting was difficult." She held his eyes steadily. "I have been watching you for 7 weeks. I have seen you at 5 in the morning and at midnight, and in the middle of a crisis, and in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. I have seen what you are when you forget to manage yourself. And what I've seen is—" She stopped, chose the words carefully. "Worth the cost, whatever the cost turns out to be." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and she let him look, because some things needed to be seen clearly before they could be trusted. "The 3 months are up in 9 days, he said. "I know." "I haven't asked you what you're planning." "No," Eleanor said. "You haven't." Another silence. Outside, the Wyoming night was fully dark now, the stars thick overhead. The ranch settled into its nighttime quiet. Somewhere in the bunkhouse a low voice carried, and someone laughed, and the ordinary life of the place went on around them. "I'm asking now," Caleb said. His voice was very quiet. "What are you planning?" Eleanor looked at him, at this difficult, careful, honest man who had been building a wall around himself for so long that he'd forgotten it was a choice and not a condition. And she felt the thing she'd been not naming for weeks settle into a shape she could no longer pretend she couldn't identify. "I'm planning," she said, "to be here for the court hearing." Something moved through his expression. "The hearing's in 31 days. "Yes," Eleanor said, "it is." He understood what she was saying. She could see him understanding it, could see him deciding whether to take the step that accepting it would require. The step that meant trusting a thing he'd broken his own habit of trusting. He was still deciding when they heard it. Hoofbeats on the main road, coming fast, coming toward the ranch, and both of them were on their feet before the sound resolved into anything specific. Because in Eleanor's 7 weeks at the Broken Spur, she had learned what ordinary nighttime sounds were, and this wasn't one of them. Hector's voice came through the window, sharp and urgent. "Caleb!" And the decision, the one that had been sitting between Eleanor and Caleb in the lamplight, like something fragile and precious and not yet fully formed, would have to wait for whatever came through the door next. The rider was Tom, and he'd pushed his horse hard enough that the animal was blowing when he pulled up in the yard. He was down before it stopped moving, which told Caleb everything about the urgency before a word was spoken. "Aldridge filed an emergency injunction this afternoon," Tom said. "Cord heard it at the telegraph office. The clerk was talking about it to anyone who'd listen. Aldridge is claiming the original homestead survey is fraudulent. His lawyer filed papers saying your father falsified the filing date in 1861. Tom caught his breath. "The territorial judge is being asked to freeze the property pending review. Full freeze. Cattle, water rights, everything. Hearing's been moved up. Day after tomorrow. Cheyenne." The yard was very quiet for a moment. "Day after tomorrow," Caleb said. 7 in the morning. "Carrie's already been notified. He sent word with me. He needs Mrs. Hargrove in Cheyenne tonight if she can travel. Says her testimony about the document dates is the centerpiece of the defense, and he needs time to prepare her for cross-examination." Caleb turned to look at Eleanor, who was standing in the doorway with a lamp behind her, and an expression he recognized. The field surgeon's expression. Already working the problem. Already 3 steps ahead of the emotion. "I need an hour," she said, "to pack and write out everything I have on the survey dates. All of it, in order, with the page references." She looked at Tom. "Is Carrie still in Laramie, or has he ridden to Cheyenne?" He's at the Calloway house, waiting. Then we ride to town first. I want to go over the documents with him tonight before we travel. She looked at Caleb. Can Hector manage the ranch for 2 days? He's managed it longer than that, Caleb said. Then give me an hour. She turned and went into the house, and Caleb stood in the yard for a moment, listening to her move through the rooms with the quick, efficient certainty of someone who has assessed a situation and committed to it completely. And he felt something he had not felt in a very long time standing in this yard in the dark. The specific relief of not being alone with the thing bearing down on him. He went to help her prepare. They rode to Laramie in the dark, with Tom ahead and Eleanor beside Caleb, and she talked him through what she expected Aldridge's argument to be. The move was clever, she said. She said it without admiration, but with the precise respect that a serious person gives a serious opponent. By claiming Jedediah Whitfield had falsified the original survey date, Aldridge was attempting to collapse the entire foundation of Caleb's defense. If the 1861 survey was fraudulent, the date discrepancy Eleanor had found ceased to matter. Aldridge's deed could be fraudulent and Caleb's homestead claim could be fraudulent simultaneously, and the court would be left with two competing frauds and no clean answer. He's been planning this since Cheyenne, Eleanor said. He knew we found the discrepancy, so he built a counter. It's not a strong argument on its merits. Falsifying a homestead claim in 1861 would have required corrupting a territorial official, and the record for that kind of corruption tends to leave traces. But it doesn't need to be strong on its merits. It only needs to be complicated enough to delay the decision. And a freeze on the property while the court deliberates, Caleb said, would take your operating capital and your grazing rights through winter. Yes, she paused. Which is what he actually wants. He doesn't need to win in court. He needs to make the cost of fighting higher than the cost of selling. I won't sell. I know, Eleanor said. That's why he has to make the cost high enough that selling stops being a choice and becomes a necessity. She looked at him in the dark. But he miscalculated. How? He doesn't know what I found yet. He knows I found the date discrepancy. He doesn't know I also pulled the chain of title on every property his client has claimed in the last 8 years, while Carrie and I were working through the counter motion. She paused. There are 4 of them. Each one has the same pattern. A survey date that follows the deed date by 4 to 6 weeks. Each one settled before it reached a territorial court because the property owner ran out of money to fight. Each one handled by the same surveyor out of Denver. The horse moved beneath her, and the stars were very bright overhead, and Caleb was quiet, in the way he was quiet when he was understanding something that rearranged things. He's done this before, Caleb said. Systematically, for at least 8 years. Eleanor kept her voice level. Which changes the nature of the case. It's not a dispute over one property. It's evidence of a pattern of fraud across multiple territorial jurisdictions. Carrie can argue it to the federal level if the territorial court doesn't move fast enough. She paused. And federal involvement changes everything for Aldridge. He can manage a territorial judge. He cannot manage a federal inquiry into 8 years of systematic land fraud. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. When did you find this? 3 days ago. Eleanor, I wanted to be certain before I said anything. The last time I told you something before I was certain, you made a decision you shouldn't have made. She said it without accusation. I needed all 4 cases confirmed before I gave it to Carrie. I gave it to him this morning. She paused. I was going to tell you tonight, before Tom arrived. That was the conversation, Caleb said slowly. Before the hoofbeats. You were building to something. Yes. He was quiet again. Then, "You have been carrying this for 3 days alone?" I know the difference." He didn't answer that, but she could feel something shift in the quality of his silence. Not the silence of withholding, but the silence of a man absorbing something at a depth where words hadn't formed yet. Carrie met them at the Calloway house, with his coat on and his papers spread across Ruth's dining table, and the focused energy of a lawyer who has seen a path through a problem and intends to walk it as fast as his legs will carry him. Ruth stood at the edge of the room with coffee and the expression of a woman who had been useful in emergencies for 23 years and intended to remain so. Eleanor put her notes on the table and walked Carrie through the 4 cases in 40 minutes. She watched his expression change as she laid out the pattern, the careful lawyer's neutrality giving way to something that was, briefly and unmistakably, fury, before it settled back into calculation. "This is extraordinary," Carrie said. "It's a paper trail," Eleanor said. "He was careless because he's never been seriously challenged. The records are all there. They just require someone to look at them with the right question in mind." The right question being, not whether the claim is fraudulent. That's what everyone asks. The right question is whether the fraud is the same fraud. Whether the same hand is in the same pocket across multiple cases. She paused. Once you're looking for the pattern instead of the individual instance, it's not subtle. Carrie looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb. "I need 3 hours with her tonight. Alone. Cross-examination preparation." He picked up his pen. "Aldridge will come after her history in Savannah. He'll try to establish that she's an unreliable witness with a financial motive to help you keep the ranch. I need her ready for every version of that argument." "She'll be ready," Caleb said. "I'll be ready," Eleanor said simultaneously, and Carrie had the good sense not to comment on which of them had spoken for whom. Caleb sat in Ruth's front parlor while Eleanor and Carrie worked at the dining table, and Ruth brought him coffee and sat across from him in the straightforward way she had, and didn't say anything for a while because she understood when silence was what was needed. It was Caleb who spoke first. "She found the pattern 3 days ago," he said. 4 cases, 8 years of fraud. She found it, confirmed it, verified it, and delivered it to Carrie this morning, without telling me until she was certain." "That sounds like her," Ruth said. "I sent her away," Caleb said, "before she arrived. I sent Hector with $40 and a ticket, because I decided before she ever stepped off the train that I wasn't worth the trouble she'd be taking on." He looked at his hands. "I had decided, Ruth, completely, irrevocably. And I was wrong in a way I've been wrong about very few things in my life. And I have been trying to figure out how to say that to her in a way that is adequate to how wrong I was." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You saved her ranch," she said. He looked up. "You offered her work when she had nowhere to go," Ruth said. "You gave her the account books and let her use her mind. You told Beck you behaved badly, and you rode to Laramie the morning after you sent the envelope because something in you already knew." She folded her hands in her lap. "I'm not saying you handled everything right, because you didn't, and I suspect Eleanor has told you so in clearer terms than I would. But Caleb, you have been doing consistently for 7 weeks the thing you should have done from the beginning. The question isn't whether you were wrong in March. The question is who you've been since September." He was quiet for a long moment. Through the wall, he could hear Eleanor's voice, steady and composed, walking through the documents one more time. And he thought about what it cost a person to be steady and composed when everything was at stake, and how she'd been paying that cost quietly and consistently, without asking to be recognized for it. "I want to ask her to stay," he said. "Not as my housekeeper, as—" He stopped. "I know what you mean," Ruth said. "I don't want to do it wrong again." His voice was rough. "I don't want to say the thing in the wrong way at the wrong time and have it come out as something it isn't. I've done that before. Said the right thing in a way that made it the wrong thing." Ruth looked at him with the patient clarity of a woman who had watched 23 years of human beings trying to find the words for the things that mattered most. "Caleb," she said, "after tomorrow. Say it after tomorrow. When the court has done what it's going to do, and the immediate crisis is past, and you can both breathe." She paused. "She'll still be there. That's what she's been trying to tell you." The hearing room in Cheyenne was smaller than Eleanor had expected and more crowded. She had not anticipated the number of people who had come to watch. Ranchers from 3 counties, she gathered. Men who had been watching Victor Aldridge operate for years and had never had sufficient grounds to challenge him. They filled the benches and stood along the walls with the quiet attention of people who have a stake in the outcome of something that officially belongs to someone else. Aldridge sat at his table with his lawyer and 2 men Eleanor didn't know, and he watched Eleanor take her seat beside Carrie with an expression that was still, finally, perfectly neutral. The expression of a man who had concluded that the time for charm had passed. The judge was a woman of 60 named Harriet Voss, which Eleanor had not expected, and which settled something in her chest the moment she saw her. Judge Voss had the face of someone who had heard every version of every argument, and was no longer impressed by any of them, and was interested only in what the documents said. Aldridge's lawyer went first. He was good. Eleanor gave him that. He built the argument about Jedediah Whitfield's survey with careful precision, introducing a notarized statement from the Denver surveyor claiming the original 1861 filing date was inconsistent with the survey methodology of the period. It was technical and detailed, and would have been convincing to anyone who hadn't spent 3 weeks reading original territorial land records. When Carrie rose, he put Eleanor's documentation on the record first. The original homestead filing, the original survey, the chain of title, and established the foundation cleanly and without drama. Then he called Eleanor to the stand. She told the truth. That was the whole of her strategy. Tell the truth in the order it happened, clearly, without embellishment, and let the documents do what documents do when they're real, and the documents on the other side are not. Aldridge's lawyer cross-examined her for 40 minutes. He went after her history in Savannah with the methodical persistence she'd prepared for, and she answered every question directly and completely. Because the history wasn't a liability, it was a fact, and facts handled honestly tend to stop being weapons. When he got to Robert's debts, she said, "My husband spent 8 years providing medical care to people who couldn't afford to pay because that was the right thing to do. The debts that resulted from that choice are the evidence of his character, not a mark against mine." She paused. "I paid every creditor I could find before I left Savannah. The record of those payments is available if the court requires it." Judge Voss looked at the lawyer. The lawyer moved on. When he suggested that Eleanor's findings were motivated by her personal interest in the Whitfield Ranch's survival, she said, "My findings are motivated by what the original documents say. I would invite the court to examine the originals, which are in this room, against the copies Mr. Aldridge's client filed. The dates will speak for themselves." Judge Voss pulled the documents toward her and examined them in silence for a long moment. Then she looked at Aldridge's table with an expression that made 2 of the men there shift in their seats. Carrie introduced the 4 prior cases in the final hour. He walked through each one. The same surveyor, the same date pattern, the same outcome. In the precise, unhurried way of a man who knows the weight of what he's laying down and is letting the room feel it fully. By the 3rd case, the benches behind Eleanor had gone completely silent. By the fourth, she could hear the specific quality of that silence and knew what it meant. The assembled ranchers of 3 counties understood happening to people they knew, and that it had been allowed to happen because no one had looked at the right documents with the right question in mind. Victor Aldridge sat very still through all of it, and Eleanor watched him without looking like she was watching, and she saw the precise moment he understood that the territory he'd been operating in for 8 years had shifted under his feet and was not going to shift back. Judge Voss ruled from the bench. She did not reserve judgment or schedule a follow-up hearing or take the matter under advisement. She ruled. The injunction was denied. The fraudulent claim was dismissed. The 4 prior cases were referred to the federal territorial prosecutor for investigation. The surveyor's license was suspended pending a criminal inquiry. And Harlan Beck, whose name had appeared in the chain of title on 2 of the 4 prior cases, was referred to the Territorial Bar Association for a disciplinary hearing. When the gavel came down, the room behind Eleanor did not erupt. It simply exhaled. A long collective breath of people who have been holding something for a long time and have finally been given permission to put it down. Caleb stood up from the bench 2 rows back. Eleanor turned and found him there, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Every wall down, every practiced control suspended. Just a man standing in a courtroom in Cheyenne, Wyoming territory, looking at a woman who had just saved his family's land with a paper trail and steady hands and the refusal to be anything less than exactly who she was. He crossed the room in 4 strides. He stopped in front of her and didn't say anything for a moment, because this was Caleb Whitfield, and Caleb Whitfield did not speak until he was certain of what he meant. "Eleanor," he said. "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Don't thank me," she said. "Don't tell me I was remarkable, or capable, or more than you expected. I know what I am. I've known for a long time. I don't need it confirmed." She held his eyes. "Tell me the actual thing." The room had emptied around them in the way rooms empty when something private is happening in a public space, and people with any sense understand it's time to find somewhere else to be. Ruth had shepherded Carrie toward the door. The benches were clearing. Even Aldridge had gone, slipping out with his lawyers into whatever reckoning awaited him, leaving the room to the 2 people who had come to this moment by the longest road available. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "I don't want you to leave at the end of 3 months," he said. "I don't want you to leave at the end of 30 years. I want you here, not because the ranch needs managing, or because Billy needs patching up, or because the account books need someone who understands them." He stopped. "I want you here because this morning I got up before dawn, and the first thing I thought was, what will Eleanor say when the judge rules? And I realized that's been the first thing I think every morning for 7 weeks. What will Eleanor think? What will Eleanor say? What will Eleanor find that I haven't thought to look for?" His voice was rough, but it didn't waver. "I spent 6 years deciding that the cost of letting someone close enough to matter was too high. And then you came, 1,100 miles, and handed back my $40, and the whole argument fell apart." Eleanor looked at him, this man who had been wrong about her and had come back anyway, who had kept every word he'd given her, who had stood at the edge of a room that cost him something to stand in, and stayed because he'd decided she deserved it. "I have conditions," she said. Something moved across his face, something that was absolutely, finally, a smile. "I expected you would. I want to practice medicine, not as a hobby, not in emergencies only. There are families in this territory without access to anyone with medical training, and that is a problem I am qualified to address, and I intend to." She held his gaze. "I want the account books, both sets, everything, not summaries. Done. And I want Ruth at the wedding, if there is one, because she is the reason I didn't get back on a train to Savannah, and that deserves to be acknowledged in a formal setting." Caleb's smile deepened. "Is that all?" "No," Eleanor said. "I want you to understand something first. Before I give you an answer, I want you to understand it completely." She took one step toward him, closing the last of the distance between them. "I am not here because I have nowhere else to go. I am not here because you were the best available option, or the most convenient arrangement, or the only man in Wyoming territory who offered me work." She looked up at him directly, letting him see all of it. Every mile of the road that had brought her here, every cost she paid, every morning she'd gotten up in the cold dark and chosen to keep going. "I am here because you are worth staying for. Because this ranch and these people and this hard, honest, specific life are worth staying for. Because you looked at me on a street in Laramie and said I behaved badly without flinching, and then spent 7 weeks proving it was true." She paused. "I choose this, Caleb, not because I have to, because I want to. There is a world of difference between those two things, and I need you to know that I know the difference." He was very still for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I know." "Then yes," Eleanor said. "There is a wedding." He reached out and took her hand, and Eleanor felt the familiar texture of his palm against hers. Work-roughened, steady. The hand of a man who built things that lasted, and she held it back with equal steadiness. And that was the whole of it. No grand gesture, no performance. Just two people standing in a courtroom in Cheyenne, Wyoming, in the fall of 1879, having arrived at each other by the most inconvenient possible route, and having decided, with full knowledge of the cost, that it was exactly the right place to be. Ruth was waiting outside with Carrie, and when she saw their faces, she pressed both hands to her mouth, and then recovered herself and said, "Well, it's about time." "You knew," Caleb said. "I knew before you did," Ruth said. "Both of you." "She generally does," Eleanor said. They rode back to the Broken Spur in the late afternoon, the three of them, and Carrie and Tom. And the light was doing what Wyoming light did in October, burning low and amber through the dry grass, turning the mountains to copper, making everything it touched look permanent and chosen. Eleanor sat beside Caleb and didn't talk much, because some things didn't need narrating, and this was one of them. Hector was in the yard when they rode in, and he read their faces the way he read everything, quickly, without fuss. And he nodded once at Eleanor, with the expression of a man whose long-running calculation had come out right. "Court went well," he said. It was not a question. "Court went well," Eleanor confirmed. "Supper's ready," he said. "Billy cooked." A brief, collective pause. "How bad is it?" Caleb asked. "It's edible," Hector said. "Mostly." Eleanor laughed, genuinely, from somewhere deep, the laugh of a woman who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and has finally put it down in a place where it can stay. She was still laughing when she walked through the door of the Broken Spur, into the warmth and the smell of Billy's ambitious and imperfect cooking, and the sound of her household, gathered around a table that had room for everyone. She took her place at it and felt the shape of the life she was walking into settle around her, the way a coat settles around shoulders it was made for. Not without weight, not without the knowledge that winters were coming, and hard seasons were part of what she had agreed to, but fitted and warm and entirely, irreversibly hers. The woman who had pressed $40 flat against a stranger's chest on a Laramie train platform and refused to be paid off like a bad debt had not come west looking for this. She had come west looking for survival, for a roof and a purpose and enough ground under her feet to stand on. She had found, instead, the ground she was always meant to stand on, and the man, and the work, and the life that proved something she had nearly stopped believing. That a woman who refuses to be less than herself, even when everything is telling her to accept less, will eventually arrive somewhere that is worth every mile of the road it took to get there. Eleanor Hargrove had been rejected, rerouted, and underestimated every step of the way. She had answered none of it with surrender. That was not how her story ended. That was how it began.